Dawn was a thin smear of gunmetal over the river when the first truck disappeared into the sky. One moment, it was a lumbering gray shape in the Russian supply column. Rations, fuel cans, ammunition stacked high. And the next, it was a geyser of flame and metal, ripped apart by a blast that seemed to come from beneath the road. Men screamed. Tires shredded. Diesel turned into a carpet of fire that fed the next truck, then the next, until the convoy was a tumbling pyre that lit the morning like a bad sun. Ukrainian Commandos had been watching that route for weeks. They knew the timing.
Ukraine claims it detonated a powerful bomb under a key Russian bridge to Crimea.
Explosion on a bridge linking Russia to the occupied Crimean Peninsula.
Sabotage operation against a strategic Russian target, the Crimea Bridge.
Out of Ukraine, Kyiv has taken credit for an explosion.
Shift changes at the forward depots, the road's weak bridges, the way Russian columns relaxed between checkpoints. What Kyiv wanted was not simply to stop a convoy, but to turn its logistics chain into proof that no supply line was safe. The operation they planned would be surgical in ambition, but theatrical in effect. Rig a key bridge with shaped charges and concealed mines, lure the convoy into a kill zone, and detonate everything in sequence so fuel, ammunition, and vehicles amplified each other's destruction. It was the kind of asymmetric warfare that rewrites the calculus of an advance overnight. The bridge itself looked innocent from a distance, an aging span of concrete girders crossing a slow river, its guardrails rusted and its understructure choked with reeds. Locals had driven across it for years, unaware that Ukrainian sappers had crawled along its undersides in the dark, bolting charges to load-bearing beams, burying anti-tank mines in the approaches, and hiding remote triggers in a nearby culvert under the cover of a foraging deer. Some charges were timed. Others were wired to command detonators because the assault depended on an exact moment when the lead vehicles were on the middle span and the bulk of the column would be trapped. That moment came as the sun burned the mist off the fields. A forward spotter, an unmanned drone flying low and skirted by a shepherd's curse, gave the signal. The convoy was on the way, slower than predicted, the column wrapped in dust that made them easier to see from above. The commander, a veteran who had watched whole battalions evaporate in artillery barges, felt his hands go steady. He counted the beats on his radio like a metronome, waiting for the middle of the truck train to ride the bridge. When the column's great bulk finally straddled the span, he pressed the switch. The first detonation tore out the bridge's central pier. Concrete exploded skyward in a bouquet of rebar and river water. The lead trucks plunged, cab first, into a boiling churn. That was the trap. The rest were the bait. As the bridge collapsed, the road became an instant cul-de-sac. Trucks piled up nose to tail, fuel ruptured, munitions detonated in cascading secondary blasts. Flames licked the riverbank. The air filled with the staccato of cooking off rounds and the ragged cries of men. Within minutes, the supply convoy that Russian planners had counted on to feed the front was no more than smoking wreckage. This is the brutal arithmetic of modern interdiction. A few kilograms of properly placed explosives can turn 1,000 tons of material into fodder for fire. Kyiv's use of bridges and key choke points as force multipliers has precedent in recent months. Ukraine has repeatedly struck critical crossings and transport routes to sever Russian logistics, sometimes employing underwater charges or remotely guided drones to reach targets under or beneath bridges. Those operations have been publicly claimed by Kyiv's security services at times, and they have prompted fierce Russian denunciations. The immediate tactical payoff was obvious. Units waiting behind the bridge found themselves cut off from resupply. No fuel, no spare parts, no fresh ammunition. The frontline assault that afternoon stalled as crews scrounged for water and tried to jury-rig broken transmissions. Russian commanders, scrambling to plug the gap, rerouted convoys along longer, more exposed roads that only multiplied vulnerability to drones and artillery. In the weeks that followed, what had been a route for a single column became a chronic supply crisis in that sector. Supply tables slumped, morale, which feeds on certainty, faltered. But the operation did more than break a convoy. It sent a message, one meant as much for Moscow as for soldiers in the field. Ukrainian forces had the reach and the patience to strike where it hurt most, and they would not shy from turning infrastructure into the battlefield. That message carried cost. International law and wartime ethics collide in these shadow zones. Bridges are public goods. Civilian traffic, humanitarian deliveries, and neutral parties sometimes rely on them. When a military force rigs a bridge, collateral harm becomes an ugly certainty. Moscow's immediate response mixed fury with a recalibration of tactics. They diverted fuel convoys under heavy escort, dug new supply caches, and accelerated the use of railway routes, only to find rail networks themselves under attack in separate operations. Russian air defenders and engineers doubled down on rear area security, but fixing every bridge and guarding every truck proved impossible. The Kremlin also launched an information offensive, amplifying civilian suffering while accusing Kyiv of terrorist sabotage, designed to create domestic pressure on Western backers. International reactions were predictably split. Some partners warned Kyiv to consider civilian risk, while others privately acknowledged that cutting the enemy's logistics can be the most humane way to end a fight sooner rather than later. On the ground, survivors told the raw stories that statistics can't hold. A driver whose convoy had caught fire later described the bridge collapse as a wall of white, a moment when the horizon folded and the world narrowed to heat and falling metal. Another soldier, rescued from a half-submerged cabin, said the worst sound was not the explosion but the long, slow snap of things breaking. The cables, the crates, then a radio dying mid-breath. For Ukrainian sappers and commandos, there was rarely glee in the aftermath, only grim calculation and the knowledge that war is paid in human hours. Strategically, the bridge strike altered timelines. What could have been a steady, grinding push by mechanized brigades became a staccato of thrusts and halts, each costly and each an opportunity for Kyiv to counterattack when the enemy was weakest. Militarily isolated pockets are easier to roll up. Supply-starved units surrender more readily or crumble under pressure. Politically, the operation hardened positions in Moscow and bolstered Kyiv's bargaining chips by forcing Russia to commit resources to rear-area defense rather than frontline offensives. Yet for all the tactical rationale, the operation's moral and diplomatic aftershocks were complex. Humanitarian agencies warned of increased civilian risk along rerouted corridors. Neutral observers called for better safeguards to prevent non-combatants from being trapped in choke points. And analysts asked a creeping question. If logistics nodes are now deliberate targets, what does that mean for civilians who live where supply lines run? War, it seems, continues to shrink the space for innocence. By nightfall, the bridge was a black skeleton, its twisted girders outlined against the moon. Soldiers on both sides lit fires from what they could salvage. Survivors dug through ash for documents and dog tags, for reasons of honor, if not hope. Far from the river, in command rooms with maps pinned to walls and cold coffee on stained desks, generals adjusted plans. The war never paused for grief. It only absorbed it and marched on. In the end, the operation that turned a Russian supply convoy into a firestorm was a blunt lesson in the arithmetic of modern war. Control the roads, and you starve an army. Deny supply, and you bludgeon momentum. Strike infrastructure, and you shift the balance of power, if only for a moment. That moment, like the smoke over the river, moved and dispersed, leaving behind both tactical gain and the harder questions that always follow when violence meets necessity.